You think your intellect is a light, but I tell you, it is a beautifully decorated prison. The more answers you gather, the more deeply you bury your own dynamic innocence. Your knowledge is nothing but an escape from the profound mystery of the present moment. If you want to know the ultimate reality, you must drop this heavy burden of being smart. You must have the courage to become a holy fool. In this profound discourse, Osho unravels the hidden trap of the human intellect, explaining how our accumulation of knowledge, logic, and societal cleverness has disconnected us from true existential wisdom. Through the timeless, paradoxical humor of Mullah Nasruddin, we are invited to look beyond the rigid conditioning of the mind and rediscover the pristine innocence of the soul. Learn why true intelligence requires the courage to drop the egoistic intellect and embrace the deep, transformative wisdom of being a simple fool. My beloved friends, I see you running. I see you running day in and day out, gathering thoughts, collecting information, piling up degrees, and wrapping yourselves in the heavy, suffocating blankets of logic and philosophy. You believe that the more you know, the more intelligent you become. You believe that your intellect is a golden ladder that will take you to the highest peaks of success, understanding, and ultimate fulfillment. But I want to tell you a taboo truth, a truth that your universities will never whisper, a truth that your priests will fiercely hide from you, and a truth that your deeply conditioned society is absolutely terrified of admitting. Your intellect is making you profoundly stupid. Yes, look at yourself, look at your life, look at your anxieties, look at your endless, looping miseries. The more intellectual you try to be, the more disconnected you become from the simple, vibrant, and overflowing stream of existence. Your mind has become a crowded marketplace, an endless chatter of dead words, borrowed ideas, and mechanical formulas. You have traded your alive intelligence for a plastic, mechanical intellect. You have become like a machine that can calculate everything but can feel absolutely nothing. And this is what I call the ultimate foolishness. True intelligence is not an accumulation of facts. It is the clean, unclouded capacity to see reality exactly as it is, without the interference of your prejudices, your logic, and your books. Before we dive deeper into this mystery, before we peel back the layers of this beautiful illness called the mind, take a silent moment with me. If you feel a resonance with these words, if your heart feels a sudden spark of truth here, make sure to subscribe to this channel so we can walk this path of awakening together. Drop a deep comment below sharing what your mind is currently struggling with, and share this video with those beautiful souls in your life who are trapped in the prison of their own overthinking. If you wish to support the continuation of these insights and help this temple of consciousness expand to every corner of this suffering world, you are always welcome to use the join button or offer a gift of appreciation through super thanks. Every bit of your love helps us keep this flame alive. And for those who want to dive even deeper into these silent spaces, our carefully prepared ebooks are available to guide your inner journey. Let your support flow naturally, just as a river flows toward the ocean. Let us look at the marvelous figure of Mullah Nasruddin. He is not a historical character, he is a cosmic mirror. He represents the ultimate absurdity of the human mind, the ridiculous lengths to which your logic will go to protect its own ignorance. Think of a rich farmer who had been trying desperately to marry off his daughters. One day he met Mullah Nasruddin. The farmer said to him, "I have several daughters. I would like to see them comfortably fixed. And I will say this, they won't go to their husbands without a little bit in the bank either. The youngest one is 23, and she will take 25,000 rupees with her. The next one is 32, and she will take 50,000 rupees with her. Another is 43, and she will take 75,000 rupees with her." Nasruddin listened very carefully, his eyes shining with mathematical calculation, his intellect working at maximum speed. He looked at the farmer and said, "That is very interesting. I was just wondering if you happen to have one who is about 50 years old. Look at this logic. This is exactly how your intellect works. It looks at the numbers, it looks at the profit, it looks at the linear progression of things, and it completely misses the organic reality of life. The intellect is always quantitative. It can count the money, it can measure the age, it can calculate the net worth, but it is entirely blind to love, entirely blind to beauty, entirely blind to the living, breathing human being." Nasruddin's intellect tells him that if a 43-year-old brings 75,000, a 50-year-old must bring an even bigger fortune. He doesn't see that a 50-year-old woman is a completely different reality than a 23-year-old girl. He doesn't see life. He sees an arithmetic column, and this is what you are doing with your lives every single day. You choose your careers through calculation. You choose your life partners through calculation. You even try to measure your meditation and your spirituality through calculation. You ask, "If I meditate for 1 hour, how much peace will I get? If I do this good deed, how many points will I score in heaven?" This is the stupidity of the intellect. It treats life as a business transaction. But life is not a business. Life is an unconditional, mad, overflowing love affair. It cannot be categorized by your logic. And the moment you try to force it into your mental boxes, you kill it. You are left with a dead specimen, and then you wonder why your life feels so dull, why you feel so empty and unfulfilled. Consider another beautiful adventure of the young Nasruddin. His family was deeply upset because the girl he was planning to marry was a stubborn atheist. His mother sat him down, weeping, and said, "We will not have you marrying an atheist. It will ruin our family reputation. It will bring a curse upon our house." Nasruddin looked at her with tears in his eyes and said, "What can I do? I love her." His mother, being a very clever and practical woman, gave him a piece of advice. She said, "Well, if she loves you, she will do anything you ask. You should talk religion to her. If you are persistent, if you use your intellect and arguments, you can win her over." Several weeks went by, and Nasruddin spoke to her every single day. He brought out all the scriptures, all the theological proofs for the existence of God, all the logical frameworks of heaven and hell. Then, one morning at breakfast, the young mullah seemed absolutely broken-hearted. He couldn't eat his bread. He couldn't drink his tea. His mother asked him anxiously, "What is the matter, my son? I thought you were making such good progress in your talks about religion to your young girlfriend." Nasruddin looked up with a face full of despair and said, "That is the trouble. I overdid it. Last night she told me she was so thoroughly convinced by my arguments that she is going to study to be a nun. This is the beautiful trap of argument. The intellect believes that through words, through debate, through logical convincing, it can control reality. It can direct love. It can create a perfect situation. But the intellect always overdoes it because it doesn't know where to stop. The intellect has no brakes. It is a runaway train of thoughts. Nasruddin wanted a religious wife who would marry him, but his arguments were so devastatingly perfect that they convinced her to leave the world altogether and enter a convent. He won the argument, but he lost the woman. This is the story of your life. Every time you win an argument with your spouse, with your children, with your friends, look closely at what happens. You win the argument. Your ego feels very fulfilled, very bloated, very proud. But you lose the love, you lose the connection, you lose the bridge that connects your heart to theirs. The intellect wins the battle, but loses the entire war of life. You can be right, or you can be happy. You can never be both simultaneously. To be right is the obsession of the intellect, the obsession of the ego. To be happy, to be in love, you have to be willing to be wrong. You have to be willing to drop all your brilliant arguments and just be an innocent nobody. Let these words sink into the deepest core of your being. Feel the truth of it. Let your mind rest for a moment, and let your heart feel the silent joy of this gathering. If you find value in these midnight realizations, if you want this message of freedom to reach millions of sleeping minds across the globe, please remember to hit the like button. Share your thoughts in the comment section. Tell me about a time your intellect won an argument but broke a relationship. Your comments are a beautiful mirror for others to learn from. And if you feel an organic gratitude arising from your heart, if you want to support this oasis of freedom, consider joining our inner circle via the join button, or send a token of love through super thanks. Your material support ensures that we can continue to offer these spiritual treasures to everyone freely, and our collection of e-books is always there to hold your hand through the dark nights of your soul. Life cannot be managed by rules. Look at how silent existence is. The trees grow without looking at a manual. The stars move without a traffic policeman. The seasons change without a cosmic calendar. Everything happens on its own, through a deep, spontaneous, and unspoken trust. But the human being is terrified of spontaneity. The human being wants everything written down, signed, sealed, and delivered. The young lady's hopes had been very high for 2 long years, while Mullah Nasruddin remained absolutely silent on the urgent question of marriage. She waited and waited, but he never said a word. Then, one magical evening, as they were sitting under the moonlight, he looked at her and said, "I had a most unusual, most extraordinary dream last night. I dreamed that I asked to marry you. I wonder what that means." The girlfriend looked at him with an pure expression of exasperation and said, "That means you have far more sense asleep than you have awake." She was absolutely right. When you are asleep, your intellect relaxes. When you are asleep, your ego goes on a holiday. In your deep sleep, your calculations stop, your defenses drop, and your true nature, your unconscious, natural self, comes to the surface. In his dream, Nasruddin was natural, he was loving, he was ready to jump into the beautiful insecurity of marriage. But the moment he woke up, his intellect took over. His intellect started asking, "What does this dream mean? Should I analyze it? Should I look for a psychological interpretation? Should I weigh the pros and cons of marriage?" He became cautious, he became hesitant, he became stupid. This caution of the intellect is what you call prudence, what your society calls maturity. But it is not maturity, it is a slow death. You are so afraid of making a mistake that you never live at all. You spend your entire life sitting on the bank of the river, analyzing the current, calculating the depth. studying the chemical composition of the water, while the courageous fools have already jumped in, swam to the other side, and tasted the wild joy of the ocean. The intellect is a coward. It wants a guarantee before it takes a single step. But life gives no guarantees. Life is an adventure, a dangerous game, a beautiful risk. The moment you demand a guarantee, you choose death over life. Think about another encounter of the mullah. He had been calling on his girlfriend for over a year, coming to her house every evening, eating her food, sitting on her couch, but never talking about commitment. One evening, the girl's father, who was losing his patience, stopped him at the front door just as he was leaving. The father looked at him sternly and said, "Look here, young man, you have been seeing my daughter for a whole year now, and I would like to know once and for all whether your intentions are honorable or dishonorable." Nasruddin's face instantly lit up with pure joy. His eyes sparkled, and he replied, "Do you mean to say, sir, that I actually have a choice? This is the innocence of a child, and at the same time, it is the sharpest critique of your moral structures. The intellect loves to divide life into rigid categories: the honorable and the dishonorable, the good and the bad, the saintly and the sinful. It creates a moral straitjacket and forces you to live inside it. But life does not know these artificial divisions. Life is a vast spectrum of colors, a beautiful play of light and shadow. The intellect wants to choose only the light and reject the shadow, but in doing so, it creates a deep split in your psychology. You become hypocrites. You pretend to be honorable on the outside, while your dishonorable desires brew and boil in the dark basements of your unconscious mind. Nasruddin is transparent. He doesn't pretend. When he hears that there is a choice, he is thrilled. He doesn't wear a mask of phony virtue to please the Father. He is ready to explore all options, because to him, life is a playground of curiosity, not a courtroom of judgment. If you want to drop your stupidity, you must drop your masks. You must stop trying to look holy. You must stop trying to look respectable. You must stop trying to fit into the dry, dead definitions of societal morality. You must become authentic, even if that authenticity looks shocking to the world. It is far better to be a real sinner than a fake saint, because a real sinner can grow, but a fake saint is completely stuck in his own plastic righteousness. Let us look at another glimpse of Nasruddin's domestic wisdom. His mother, constantly worrying about her son's safety and morality, said to him one morning, "Didn't I tell you that you should not let that girl come over to your room last night? You know how things like that worry me to death." Nasruddin smiled warmly and said, But mother, I didn't invite her to my room. I went over to her room. Now you can relax and let her mother do all the worrying. Look at the brilliance of this escape. The mind is an expert at shifting responsibility. It creates a flawless logic to protect its own comfort and peace of mind. Nasruddin's mother is worried about her son's morality, but Nasruddin finds a brilliant loophole. If the action happens in another room, the worry belongs to another household. This is exactly how you manage your conscience. You do something corrupt, you do something greedy, you do something violent, and your intellect immediately steps in to justify it. It says, everyone does it. It was necessary for survival. It was for the good of my family. The circumstances forced me to do it. The intellect is the greatest lawyer in the world. It can justify any crime. It can rationalize any madness, and it can make the most ugly behavior look perfectly reasonable. But whom are you fooling? You can fool your mother, you can fool your neighbors, you can fool the whole world, but you cannot fool the inner light of your own consciousness. Deep down, you know. And that split between your outer justifications and your inner truth is what creates your deep-seated guilt, your insomnia, your restlessness. You cannot sleep at night because your inner lawyer is constantly shouting, constantly defending a case that is fundamentally indefensible. To step out of this stupidity, you must fire this inner lawyer. You must look at your actions directly, with naked honesty, without any filtering, without any rationalization. If you are angry, see that you are angry. If you are greedy, see that you are greedy. Don't call your anger righteous indignation, and don't call your greed financial planning. Call things by their true names, and in that very clarity, a profound transformation will begin to happen within you. As these words echo in your silent heart, let them become a seed of awareness. If you feel this inner cleaning happening right now, take a second to hit the like button and share this message of authenticity with your friends. Leave a comment telling me what masks you are ready to drop today. If you feel inspired to keep this light burning bright and help us share these raw, unadulterated truths with seekers worldwide, click that join button to become part of our conscious family, or share a blessing through super thanks. Your support is the fuel that keeps this fire burning, and our ebooks are always available to deepen your meditation when the videos end. Let us walk together, without masks, without armor, like simple children of the universe. Let us remember another beautiful dialogue. The father of a young girl looked at Nasruddin and said, "Well, young man, I understand you want to become my son-in-law." Nasruddin scratched his head, looked around the room, and replied, No, sir, not exactly. But if I marry your daughter, I really don't see how I can get out of it. This is the essence of how the human mind enters into relationships and commitments. It doesn't enter with total passion. It doesn't enter with absolute joy. It enters through a side door of compromise, obligation, and inevitability. The intellect is always looking for a back door, always looking for a way out even before it has fully walked in. It is half-hearted. It says, I will marry you, but what if it doesn't work out? What are the divorce laws? What is the prenuptial agreement? It is always divided, always fragmented. Because of this deep mental division, your love never becomes a total explosion of cosmic bliss. It remains a lukewarm arrangement, a mechanical social contract, a safe compromise that completely suffocates your beautiful living soul. This suffocation is not accidental. It is the logical consequence of a life lived through the head. The head is a collector of old, dead facts, a warehouse of past memories and future projections. It can never be present in the immediate, vibrant now. It talks and talks, it gives lectures and sermons, but it has no authentic experience of reality. Look at your so-called public speakers, your politicians, your intellectuals who stand on high podiums and address large crowds. They have rehearsed their words. They have polished their phrases. They have organized their logic beautifully. But if you look into their eyes, you will see a profound emptiness, a complete absence of the divine stream. Mullah Nasruddin was once invited to give a speech at a prestigious dinner. He was really unaccustomed to public speaking, and as he stood up before the elite crowd, his knees began to shake, his tongue became twisted, and he arose in total confusion. He looked at the expectant faces of the audience, muttered hesitatingly, and said, "My friends, when I came here tonight, only God and myself knew what I was about to say to you. And now, only God knows." This is the absolute state of the intellectual mind. It prepares, it memorizes, it constructs brilliant scripts. But the moment it faces the unpredictable reality of the living moment, it collapses into utter confusion. True intelligence does not prepare, it responds. It is like a mirror. If you come before a mirror, it reflects you instantly. It does not carry a pre-rehearsed image of you from yesterday. It doesn't plan how to reflect you tomorrow. It is completely empty, clean, and beautifully present. But your intellect is a tape recorder, always playing back the old tapes. When life demands a spontaneous response, the tape recorder jams. You stand there in confusion, realizing that all your borrowed knowledge has evaporated, leaving behind a hollow shell. Wisdom is the realization of this inner emptiness, the understanding that the mind knows nothing of the ultimate truth. The intellect also expects immediate, predictable rewards for its artificial actions. It wants a return on every investment, a prize for every performance. Look at your marriages. They are built on this mutual expectation, this hidden business contract. After the bride's very first dinner, she turned to her new husband, Mullah Nasruddin, with high expectations and asked, "Now, my dear, what will I get if I cook a dinner like that for you every single day?" Nasruddin looked at the burnt bread, the strange, tasteless soup, and the mysterious meat on his plate, and replied without a single moment of hesitation, "My life insurance." Solitary calculations dominate the domestic life of the intellectual man. The mind wants security, it wants safety, it wants to be covered against all risks. But life is inherently risky, inherently dangerous. To love is to step into danger. To cook with love is to step into an unpredictable creative flow. The moment you turn love into a daily chore, a routine mechanism to extract a reward, it becomes toxic. It becomes a slow poisoning of the spirit. The intellect believes it is being very smart by securing its future, but a secured life is nothing but a decorated grave. You are insured against everything, but you are dead to everything. You have traded the wild, beautiful, hazardous mountain paths of existential joy for a safe, flat, monotonous highway that leads nowhere but to the cemetery. The mind can never accept things as they are. It is always looking for an anomaly, a deviation from its own rigid expectations. Mullah Nasruddin's young wife, recently returned from her beautiful honeymoon, was complaining bitterly to her close friend about her husband's terrible drinking habits. Her friend looked at her with sympathy and asked, "If you knew he drank so much, why on earth did you marry him in the first place?" Nasruddin's wife wiped her tears, shook her head, and said, "I did not know he drank at all until one night he came home sober." This is the paradox of human habit. You become so accustomed to the abnormal, so adjusted to the unconsciousness around you, that the normal looks shocking, the conscious looks terrifying. Your mind is drunk on thoughts, drunk on ambitions, drunk on societal conditioning. You have been drunk for so many lifetimes that if you suddenly meet a conscious man, a Buddha, a Christ, an awakened soul, you think he is crazy. You think he is abnormal because he doesn't join in your collective madness. He is sober, and his sobriety is a direct threat to your intoxicated comfort. The intellect prefers the predictable pattern of drunkenness over the unpredictable clarity of sudden sobriety. It wants everyone to remain in the same deep sleep, because the moment one person wakes up, the sleep of everyone else is disturbed. The intellect is also a great meddler. It is always looking for a problem to solve, even where no problem exists. It has acquired a little bit of knowledge, a few formulas, and it is desperately waiting to impose those formulas on the world. Mullah Nasruddin had just passed his intensive test for his first aid certificate. He was walking home, feeling highly accomplished, wearing his certificate like an invisible crown, his mind bursting with techniques of resuscitation and emergency care. Suddenly, he saw a man lying face down in the middle of the street. Without a second thought, without asking a single question, he threw himself upon the man, pinned his arms back, and began applying vigorous artificial respiration. After a while of being violently pumped, the man raised his sweaty head, looked at Nasruddin with absolute irritation, and said, "Sir, I don't know what on earth you are trying to do to me, but I am simply trying to fish a wire down this manhole." This is the supreme stupidity of the doer, the social reformer, the political activist, the moral missionary. You have a formula, you have a certificate, you have an ideology, and you are looking for victims to save. You don't bother to look at the reality of the situation. You don't care about the unique, living person before you. You just want to practice your first aid on them. Your politicians are trying to save the nation. Your priests are trying to save your souls. Your parents are trying to save your future. And all of them are suffocating you with their uninvited artificial respiration. They are pumping you, conditioning you, manipulating you, completely blind to the fact that you are simply trying to do your own work, find your own path, fish your own wire down the manhole of life. The intellectual mind cannot remain passive. It cannot remain silent. It has to act, it has to interfere, and through its frantic interference, it turns the whole world into a chaotic madhouse. But when the intellect is caught in its own game, when its logic is turned against itself, it instantly shifts gears to save its own skin. It has no true integrity. It only has a clever survival instinct. Mullah Nasruddin was once completely drunk at a football game, shouting obscenities, dancing on his seat, and making such a terrible nuisance of himself that the people around him grew furious and threatened to call the police if he didn't sit down and shut up immediately. At that, Nasruddin stood up even higher, puffed out his chest, and shouted at the top of his voice, "Show me a policeman, and I will show you a complete dope." The words were no sooner spoken when a massive, 6-foot-tall policeman arrived on the scene, gripped Nasruddin's shoulder with an iron fist, and said, "I am a policeman. What was that you said?" Nasruddin's eyes widened. His intellect calculated the danger in a microsecond. His face lit up with a brilliant smile, and he said, "Wonderful, I am a dope. Look at the absolute fluidity of the ego. The moment it meets a superior force, a bigger ego, a real threat, it immediately humbles itself not out of true humility, but out of absolute cleverness. It is ready to call itself a dope just to escape the consequences of its own foolishness. This is what you do in your relationships with power. Before the boss, before the king, before the politician, before the wealthy man, you become an absolute dope, a humble servant, a yes man. And the moment you find someone weaker than you, someone smaller than you, you become the big boss, the great authority, the tyrant. This flip-flopping of the mind shows its fundamental insincerity. The intellect has no center. It is just an accumulation of reactions. It is always adjusting its sails to catch the wind of self-interest. It has no root in the eternal truth of the soul. It is a superficial player on the stage of social survival. The intellect also has a deep, underlying greed that distorts its entire perception of reality. It can look at a beautiful situation and see only profit. It can look at an act of charity and see only an opportunity to exploit. A kind-hearted lady on the street saw Mullah Nasruddin limping along on heavy wooden crutches, looking miserable and pitiful. She felt a deep surge of compassion, opened her purse, and contributed generously to him. But she could not resist the temptation to preach a little bit of morality to him. She looked at him and said, "It must be absolutely terrible to be lame, my friend. But think how much worse it would be if you were completely blind." Nasruddin pocketed the money, smiled at her with total clarity, and said, "That's absolutely right, lady. When I was pretending to be blind, people kept passing counterfeit money off on me. This is the hilarious, taboo truth about your so-called miseries and your so-called spiritual practices. You choose the misery that pays best. You choose the mask that brings the most profit, the most sympathy, the most respect. Even your renunciation, your asceticism, your fasting, your long prayers are often nothing but highly sophisticated methods of begging for counterfeit coins from the crowd. The intellect calculates which disease, which victimhood, which identity will give it the maximum advantage in the social marketplace. It doesn't want to be cured. It only wants a more lucrative affliction. If blindness leads to counterfeit money, it will switch to lameness. It is always shifting its misery to ensure that the stream of profit never dries up. You don't want freedom from suffering. You only want a suffering that pays well, a suffering that feeds your ego and fills your pockets. And because the intellect is always caught up in its own projections, it is completely incapable of seeing the obvious reality that is staring it right in the face. It lives in a world of words, labels, and autosuggestions. A young father was pushing a loudly crying baby down the crowded street with what appeared to be absolute calm, self-assurance, and inner serenity. The people on the street could hear exactly what he was saying as he passed by them. "Take it easy, Nasruddin," he muttered softly. "Don't let it get you down, Nasruddin. You will soon be safe back home. Things will be all right, Nasruddin, if you just keep perfectly calm." A motherly type woman waiting for a bus heard these beautiful words, looked at his calm demeanor, and was deeply touched. She stepped forward, leaned over to the crying baby, patted its cheek, and said, "Now, don't cry, little Nasruddin. Everything is going to be all right." The father stopped, looked at the woman with the look of pure exhaustion, and said, "Lady, you have got it all completely wrong. His name is Tommy. I am Nasruddin." He was not soothing the baby. He was talking to himself. He was using a mantra, an autosuggestion, an intellectual formula to prevent himself from exploding with rage and frustration. This is exactly what your spiritual practices have become. You sit in your meditation halls, chanting peace, 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 or repeating the name of God, while inside you are boiling with anger, anxiety, and desire. You are not soothing the existential crying of your soul. You are just hypnotizing your intellect, so you don't have to face the chaos within you. Your peace is nothing but a thin coat of white paint over a dark, decaying wall. It is a psychological trick. True peace does not come from talking to yourself, from repeating formulas, from commanding yourself to be calm. True peace comes only when the talker drops completely, when Nasruddin disappears, when the mind is totally silent and empty, without any need for autosuggestion. The intellect is also obsessed with status, with social registers, with labels of respectability. It believes that if it belongs to a certain class, a certain caste, a certain high lineage, it should be treated with special care, even when it is being thrown out of existence. A mussed-up young man, Mullah Nasruddin, was sitting in a tavern, listening to another mussed-up young man describe with great anger his violent ejection from a local dance hall. Nasruddin smiled smoothly and said, "Well, I don't guess I have anything to complain about. They treated me absolutely all right. The other young man looked at him in disbelief and asked, "What on earth do you mean, treated you all right? They threw you out too, didn't they?" "Yes," said Nasruddin calmly. "They threw me out the back door, but the moment I told the bouncer that my family was in the social register, he picked me up gently, brushed the dust off my coat, escorted me politely back into the dance hall, and then he threw me out the front door. Look at this ridiculous obsession with prestige. Whether you are thrown out of the front door or the back door, the fact remains that you are thrown out. You are rejected by life, you are rejected by reality, but your intellect is perfectly satisfied if the rejection is done with etiquette, with manners, with a touch of class. This is what you call culture, what you call civilization. You are being exploited. You are being enslaved. You are being destroyed by your politicians and priests. But because they do it beautifully, because they do it with grand ceremonies, with red carpets and polite vocabulary, your intellect feels deeply honored. You are proud of your chains because they are made of polished gold. You are proud of your prison because it has a front door with a marble sign. This is the ultimate stupidity of the mind. It prefers a prestigious slavery over a simple, unadorned freedom. The intellect is also incredibly stingy when it comes to feelings. It translates everything into financial calculations, even the tears of a loved one. It cannot understand the language of the heart. It only understands the language of the ledger. One evening, Mullah Nasruddin's wife was sitting on the bed, sobbing bitterly, her chest heaving with deep sorrow. "You don't love me anymore," she said through her tears. "When you see me crying like this, you never even bother to ask why I am crying." Nasruddin sighed deeply, looked out the window, and said, "I am truly sorry, darling, but that specific sort of question has already cost me an awful lot of money in the past." To the intellect, a tear is not an expression of an overwhelmed soul. It is a symptom of an impending expense. It asks, "If I ask why she is crying, what will it cost me? Will I have to buy her a new diamond ring? Will I have to take her on an expensive vacation? Will I have to spend hours listening to her complaints?" The mind is always protecting its investment, always guarding its energy and its wealth. It cannot simply hold a hand. It cannot simply sit in silent empathy. It is too clever for that. But through this extreme cleverness, it closes all the doors of love. It remains safe. It remains rich in material terms, but it becomes an absolute beggar in the inner kingdom of consciousness. It lives in a cold, lonely desert of its own making, completely cut off from the refreshing, life-giving waters of deep human connection. And notice how the intellect manages its priorities. It places the trivial, the material, and the superficial above the vital, the living, and the essential. It gets worried about the minor details while the major reality is dying right beneath its feet. A hay wagon had completely upset in the middle of a country road, and the young driver, Mullah Nasruddin, was running around it, terribly worried, sweating profusely, and looking absolutely frantic. A kind-hearted farmer from a nearby field walked up to him and told the young fellow to forget his troubles for a moment and come into his house to have a warm, hearty supper with his family. Then we will come back out and straighten up the wagon together, the farmer said. Nasruddin hesitated and said he didn't think his father would like it at all. "Oh, don't worry about that," said the farmer warmly. "Everything will be perfectly all right. Just come and eat." So Nasruddin went inside and stayed for a long supper. Afterwards, he felt much better, wiped his mouth, and thanked the farmer profusely. But he added with a frown, "I still don't think my father is going to like this at all." The farmer laughed and said, "Forget it, son. By the way, where is your father anyway?" Nasruddin looked out the window and said, "He's under the hay. His father is suffocating under the massive pile of hay. And this intellectual young man is sitting in a comfortable dining room, enjoying a multi-course supper, because a kind farmer offered him a rational solution to calm his immediate worry. This is exactly what you are doing with your lives. Your soul is suffocating under the massive weight of your thoughts, your ambitions, your degrees, your anxieties, your societal obligations. Your true self is literally dying under the hay wagon of the ego. And what are you doing? You are going to universities. You are going to therapists. You are reading philosophy books, having a nice intellectual supper, trying to calm your mind, while the most essential part of your being is being crushed to death. You worry about the wagon. You worry about the hay. You worry about the opinion of the farmer, and you completely forget that the Father, the source of your life, the very breath of your being, is buried alive beneath it all. The intellect is also a supreme hypocrite when it comes to identity and survival. It will wear any mask, it will claim any religion, it will tell any lie just to secure a position or a job. It has no roots in truth, it only has roots in convenience. Mullah Nasruddin was once getting ready to apply to a local department store for a high-paying job. A friend came up to him and whispered that it was the strict policy of the store owners to hire absolutely nobody but devout Catholic Christians, and that if he wanted the job, he would have to lie about his religious background. Nasruddin went into the interview, put on an air of deep piety, and answered all the personal man's questions with absolute perfection. Then the personal director leaned forward and said to him, "And what church do you and your family belong to?" Nasruddin smiled angelically, crossed his heart, and said, "I am a devout Catholic, sir, and all my family have been Catholics for generations. In fact, my father is a holy priest, and my mother is a beautiful nun, sir." This hilarious lie reveals how the calculating mind completely loses all common sense, sacrificing basic biological facts just to protect its own petty professional safety. This safety is an illusion, a beautiful mirage that the intellect pursues with absolute fanaticism. It is willing to compromise its dignity, its intelligence, and its organic truth just to find a secure shelter in this insecure universe. But the universe is fundamentally an open sky. It has no roofs, it has no walls, and it offers no permanent guarantees. The intellect, in its anxiety for survival, always seeks the ultimate bargain, the ultimate arrangement where everything is provided, where every comfort is guaranteed by a company, a state, or an institution. Mullah Nasruddin once walked into a large corporation to apply for a highly lucrative job. He looked at the personnel director with an air of absolute entitlement and began his interrogation. "Does the company pay for my full hospitalization?" he asked sharply. "No, you pay for it yourself," the personnel director replied calmly. "We take it directly out of your salary each month." Nasruddin frowned deeply and said, "That is very strange. At the last place where I worked, they paid for it completely." The personnel man looked at him in surprise and said, "That is highly unusual. How much paid vacation did you get there?" 6 full weeks, replied the mullah. "Did you also get a yearly bonus?" the personnel man asked, growing more curious. "Yes," said the mullah. "Not only did they give us a massive annual bonus, they sent us a huge roasted turkey on Thanksgiving, gave us the unlimited use of a luxury company car, and threw a magnificent barbecue for us each summer." The personnel director was utterly astonished. He stood up and asked, "If it was so heavenly, why on earth did you leave?" Nasruddin shrugged his shoulders and said, "They went busted. This is the inner bankruptcy of all your security systems. You look for a system that gives you everything: free hospitalization, endless vacations, massive bonuses, company cars, and grand barbecues. And you completely forget to ask if the system itself is structurally sound. Your civilizations, your states, your empires, your organized religions are exactly like this bankrupt company. They promise you a golden paradise. They promise you eternal salvation. They promise you safety from cradle to grave, and you blindly sign their contracts. You surrender your freedom, you surrender your intelligence, you surrender your living soul to them, and in the end, the whole structure goes bust because it is built on the false foundation of human greed and exploitation. The intellect thinks it has found a shortcut to paradise, but a paradise managed by a committee of blind politicians and greedy businessmen is bound to crash. True security is not something given to you by a company or a church. True security is your inner capacity to face insecurity with a smile. Because the intellect is always looking at the surface, it remains completely oblivious to the real mechanisms of life. It climbs to the highest positions of society. It acquires grand titles, but it lacks the basic awareness of who is running the whole show. Mullah Nasruddin once got on a double-decker bus in the middle of a bustling city. Looking for a better view, he climbed up the narrow steps to the upper deck. A few minutes later, he came staggering down the steps, pale, trembling, and muttering frantically to himself. The driver noticed his distress, stopped the bus, and asked, "Is anything the matter, sir?" Nasruddin wiped the sweat from his forehead and gasped, "It ain't safe up there at all. No driver." This is the hilarious blindness of the rational mind. It looks around at the magnificent universe, the stars moving in perfect harmony, the seasons changing in absolute rhythm, the oceans breathing with the tides, the flowers blooming with exquisite design, and because it cannot see a physical driver sitting in a cockpit with a steering wheel, it panics. It says, "This universe is accidental, it is chaotic, it is mechanical, it has no consciousness guiding it, it has no driver." The intellect can only see a driver if he is localized, if he is a separate entity sitting in a specific seat. It cannot understand a driver who is identical with the vehicle itself. The driver of this cosmic bus is not a person sitting in the clouds. The driver is the very intelligence that permeates every single atom of existence. The driver is immanent, not transcendent. But to see this immanent driver, you need the eyes of meditation, the eyes of deep, silent trust. The intellect looks up at the upper deck of existence, sees an empty seat, and concludes that the whole bus is headed for a cliff. This conclusion is what you call scientific materialism, and it is one of the most sophisticated forms of stupidity ever invented by the human mind. The intellect also uses its logic to justify its past mistakes, turning its utter blindness into a philosophical inevitability. It can never simply admit that it was a fool. It must find a cosmic or psychological excuse for its foolishness. Mullah Nasruddin and his wife were having a tremendous glass-shattering argument in their kitchen. The wife was screaming at the top of her lungs, stamping her feet and crying bitterly. "I was an absolute, total fool when I married you," she yelled. Nasruddin looked at her with total serenity, nodded gently, and replied, "I guess you perfectly were, my dear. But I was so completely infatuated at the time that I didn't even notice it. Look at this beautiful escape." He agrees with her that she was a fool, but he completely absolves himself of any responsibility by claiming that his own infatuation made him blind to her foolishness. This is how you manage your relationships. You live in a state of mutual infatuation, which is nothing but a state of mutual hypnosis. You project your illusions onto the other person. You see a goddess in an ordinary woman. You see a prince in an ordinary man. And when the honeymoon is over, when the illusion shatters and the harsh reality emerges, your intellect immediately goes to work to protect your own ego. It says, "I am not at fault. The other person deceived me, or my own biological infatuation blinded me." You never look at the root cause of the problem, that any relationship based on projection is bound to turn into a battlefield. The intellect cannot love. It can only infatuate. It can only possess. It can only calculate. True love is a state of non-projection, a state where you see the other person exactly as they are, with all their limitations, and you still rejoice in their presence. But for that, you must drop the head and move into the silent valley of the heart. The mind's quantitative approach to life shows itself most clearly when faced with the grand mystery of death. When someone dies, a conscious man looks at the transience of existence, the fragility of life, and the ultimate return of the wave to the ocean. But the intellectual man looks at the financial statement. The town's richest, most powerful man had suddenly died. The next morning, another rich and particularly miserly old man met Mullah Nasruddin on the street corner. The miserly old man sighed, looked very solemn, and said, "I wonder how much he left behind." Nasruddin laughed out loud, slapped the old man on the back, and said, "Every single cent of it, sir. You cannot carry a single cent across the border of death. Alexander the Great, when he was dying, gave orders to his generals that when his body was carried to the grave, his hands should be left hanging out of the coffin empty. He wanted the whole world to see that he who had conquered the entire known world was leaving it completely empty-handed. But the intellect is completely blind to this reality. It spends its entire life accumulating wealth, accumulating power, accumulating knowledge, completely ignoring the fact that death will strip it naked in a single moment. All your accumulations are external. They belong to the world of matter. The only thing that can go with you beyond death is your inner awareness, your capacity to witness, your spiritual fragrance. But you never invest in your awareness. You invest only in your bank account. You think you are leaving your money behind, but the truth is, the money is leaving you behind, and you are left in a state of absolute spiritual poverty. This quantitative obsession is the ultimate stupidity of the mind. And because the intellect cannot face its own inner emptiness, it looks for someone else to blame for its structural misery. It creates institutions like marriage just to have a permanent scapegoat for its daily frustrations. Mullah Nasruddin used to say to his friends in the tea house, "Every man should have at least one wife, because there are some things in life that just cannot be blamed on the government. The government is the collective scapegoat for the public, and the wife is the personal scapegoat for the individual. The intellect must find someone to blame. If you are unhappy, it must be because of the Prime Minister, or because of the tax laws, or because of your spouse, or because of your parents. The mind can never accept the radical truth that your misery is your own creation, that your unhappiness is the direct result of your own lack of awareness. It is so easy, so comfortable to point a finger at someone else. It gives you a false sense of innocence. You say, "I am perfectly fine, but my wife ruins my life, or the system oppresses me." I tell you, nobody can ruin your life except your own unconsciousness. And nobody can liberate you except your own awakening. Marriage, politics, society, these are just stages where your inner drama is played out. If you are a slave inside, you will turn any relationship into a prison. If you are free inside, even a prison cell cannot contain your spirit. But the intellect loves to complain, because complaining feeds the ego, while self-observation destroys it completely. The mind also seeks change on the outside, while remaining completely stagnant on the inside. It travels to distant lands, it checks into luxury resorts, it changes its environment, believing that a geographical shift will bring a psychological transformation. Mullah Nasruddin had just checked into a high-class, beautiful hotel in a popular beach resort. The clerk at the front desk smiled warmly, bowed, and said, "Welcome to our hotel, Mullah. We want you to know that you are deeply welcome here. We are going to do absolutely everything we can to make you comfortable and help you to feel completely at home." Nasruddin looked at him with an expression of pure horror and shouted, "Please, don't do that. I left home specifically so I could find a change. For the next few days, I want to feel as if I am at a wild beach resort, completely away from that nightmare." You leave home, but you carry your home inside your head. You carry your anxieties, your conflicts, your habit patterns in your psychological luggage. You can go to the moon, you can go to the Himalayas, you can check into the most exotic resort on earth, but you will still be the same miserable person there, because you have brought your mind with you. The clerk promises to make him feel at home, and that is exactly what he is terrified of, because home means routine. Home means the old wife. Home means the old boredom. But the intellect doesn't see that the home is not a geographical location. The home is a state of mind. If your mind is crowded, chaotic, and bored, you will create a boring home wherever you go. True change is not a change of scenery. It is a change of consciousness. When you meditate, when you drop the continuous chatter of the intellect, you find an inner oasis that is always fresh, always new, always ecstatic. Then it doesn't matter where you are, in a crowded marketplace or a silent cave, you are always at home in the divine presence of existence. The intellect also misunderstands the nature of true compassion and kindness. It views life through the lens of labor, effort, and survival, and it treats a life of pure grace as a bizarre anomaly. A well-dressed lady stood at her front door, looked at Mullah Nasruddin, who was standing there in tattered clothes, holding out his hand for a handout, and asked him in a preaching voice, "Have you ever been offered work in your life, young man?" Nasruddin looked up at her with a sweet, innocent smile and said, "Only once, lady. Aside from that single unfortunate incident, I have met with nothing but absolute kindness from humanity." To the intellect, work is a virtue and begging is a sin. But Nasruddin reverses the whole equation. To him, being offered work is an act of hostility, an attempt to enslave his free spirit, while being given a handout is an act of pure kindness, an alignment with the natural grace of existence. Look at the birds, they don't work. They don't punch a time clock. They don't have a boss. Yet they are fed by the bounty of nature. Nasruddin wants to live like a bird. dependent on the spontaneous kindness of existence. He refuses to sell his time, his life, his precious moments for a few copper coins. The intellect calls this laziness, but a conscious man sees it as a profound critique of our work-obsessed civilization. You have turned work into a religion. You live to work instead of working to live. You have forgotten how to sit silently, how to do nothing, how to let things happen on their own. You are so busy making a living that you have completely forgotten to live. Nasruddin reminds us that the greatest moments of life are those of pure grace, where you receive without striving, where you are nourished by the sheer kindness of the universe. The intellect is also deeply intrigued by power and control. It wants to know the secret formula to dominate others, to make others fear it, because the ego can only feel secure when it is holding a whip. A stern judge was questioning Mullah Nasruddin in a crowded courtroom regarding a domestic dispute. "I understand from the reports," the judge said, looking down over his spectacles, "that your wife is absolutely scared to death of you. Is that true?" "That is absolutely right, Your Honor," Nasruddin said, puffing out his chest with immense pride. The judge's eyes lit up with intense curiosity. He leaned over his high bench, beckoned Nasruddin to come closer, and whispered softly in his ear, "Man to man, Nasruddin, tell me how on earth do you do it? Look at this judge. He sits on a high seat of legal authority. He commands the entire courtroom. He can send people to prison. Yet he is a henpecked husband at home, desperately looking for a secret technique to control his own wife. This is the inner reality of all your powerful leaders, your dictators, your emperors. On the outside, they display immense power, but inside, they are trembling children, terrified of their own shadows, henpecked by their own unconscious desires. The intellect loves techniques. It wants a manual on how to dominate, how to manipulate, how to create fear. But a life built on domination is a life of constant tension. If someone is scared of you, you can never relax, because you have to constantly maintain your guard, constantly hold the whip. True power is not power over others. True power is mastery over yourself. When you are full of love, full of presence, full of awareness, you don't need anyone to fear you. Your very presence radiates a natural authority that requires no whips, no judges, and no courts. But the intellect will never understand this. It will keep looking for a secret trick to rule the world, while remaining an absolute slave inside. And because the intellect lives in the past, It is completely incapable of learning from its experience in a way that leads to inner transformation. It uses its experience only to build better defenses, better strategies for the same old game. A respectable gentleman met Mullah Nasruddin on the street who had just asked him for a small handout. The gentleman looked at Nasruddin's unshaven face, his dirty clothes, and said with a tone of superiority, "You know, young man, you would stand a much better chance of getting a proper job if you would simply shave, clean yourself up, and look presentable." Nasruddin sighed, looked at him warily, and said, "Yes, sir, I found that out years ago." This response cuts through the plastic illusion of social respectability with the sharp edge of conscious detachment. He already knows the functional formulas of your competitive society. He has thoroughly analyzed the clean-shaven, polished look required to secure a position in your economic machinery. But because he has tasted the wild, unconditioned sweetness of absolute inner freedom, he consciously chooses to remain an unadorned beggar on the dusty street side. The analytical mind always assumes that the marginalized individual is simply ignorant of the rules of material success, but the authentic rebel understands the game completely and refuses to wear the heavy, respectable uniform of your organized slavery. True transformation does not lie in refining your economic presentation to please the gaze of the societal marketplace. It lies in the radical courage to drop your manufactured identity completely and exist in absolute alignment with your own living truth. By embracing the simple outer identity of a fool, you free yourself from the agonizing burden of continuously defending a fictitious status, allowing your unique soul to rest comfortably in the profound silence of its own beautiful organic reality. This deep identification with the manufactured roles of society is what creates the pervasive collective neurosis you see all around you. People are hiding inside their respectability, inside their families, inside their secure jobs, terrified that if they strip away these superficial layers, they will find nothing but absolute emptiness. Because they cannot bear the silent majesty of their own inner void, they project their madness outward, constantly judging others, constantly mapping the insanity of the world while remaining completely oblivious to the roaring chaos within their own domestic structures. Look at how beautifully Mullah Nasruddin reflects this domestic blindness. One afternoon, he reported frantically to the office of the superintendent of the state mental hospital. He rushed through the heavy doors, out of breath, his clothes in disarray, and demanded to know, "Have any of your dangerous male patients escaped from the asylum lately?" The superintendent looked at his charts, checked his records thoroughly, shook his head, and asked, "Why do you ask with such immense urgency, Mullah?" "Because," gasped Nasruddin, wiping the cold sweat from his forehead, "someone has just run off with my wife." To the calculating mind, anyone who willingly takes away his primary burden, his daily source of misery, must be an escaped lunatic. The intellect is completely incapable of seeing that it has turned its own home into an asylum. You create a hellish prison of control, possessiveness, and jealousy. And when your partner formats a small crack and escapes with someone else, you don't look into your own behavior. You don't realize that your own conditioning made her leave. Instead, your brilliant mind concludes that the person who rescued her must be mentally unstable, because who in their right mind would volunteer to inherit your specific nightmare? The mind always protects its own ego by pathologizing reality. It says, "I am perfectly sane, my marriage was perfectly normal, so the intruder must be insane." This total inability to take responsibility for your own life, for your own creations, is the supreme stupidity of the head. It keeps you perpetually blind, perpetually trapped in a loop of blaming the outside world while your inner temple remains utterly neglected. This same superficiality dominates how the intellect approaches the world of art, beauty, and creativity. It cannot simply look at a painting and feel its silent music. It cannot simply gaze at a flower and experience an explosion of wonder. It must ask a functional question. It must find a utility, a logical reason for existence. Mullah Nasruddin was once chatting in a grand, decorated hall with his wealthy master, who had recently taken up abstract painting as a fashionable hobby. Nasruddin stood before one of his master's most complex, bizarre canvases, staring intently at it for a very long time with a deeply puzzled expression. The master walked up, puffed out his chest proudly, smirked, and said, "When I look at you standing before my artwork, Nasruddin, all I see is wonder. Are you wondering how I managed to paint it?" "No, sir," replied Nasruddin calmly. "I am wondering why you did it." This continuous question of why is the absolute murder of all playfulness, the destruction of all meditative joy. The intellect is a utility-driven machine. It cannot understand anything that has no functional purpose, anything that cannot be labeled, packaged, and sold in the marketplace. It asks, "Why do you paint? Why do you dance? Why do you sit silently doing nothing?" To the mind, Everything must have a profitable target, a measurable result. But I tell you, the greatest, most sublime dimensions of existence are entirely purposeless. A rose does not bloom with a hidden agenda. It blooms simply because its inner life is overflowing with beauty. The stars do not shine to win your appreciation. They dance out of pure cosmic ecstasy. Love has no why. Meditation has no why. The moment you force life into the straitjacket of purpose, you turn it into a cold, mechanical business transaction. You become highly efficient, highly successful, but inside you become a beautifully decorated corpse. To be truly alive, you must drop this obsessive intellectual calculation and learn the art of doing things for the sheer, unadulterated joy of doing them. The intellect also judges the value of wisdom, spiritual insight, and truth by the material net worth of the person delivering it. It believes that a man who possesses no money can possess no intelligence, because to the mind, currency is the ultimate measurement of human capability. Mullah Nasruddin once approached a genteel-appearing, elegantly dressed elderly man sitting on a park bench with a long, heart-wrenching tale of extreme poverty and a humble request for immediate assistance. The old gentleman listened with deep empathy, sighed gently, and said, "I am truly sorry, my young friend. I have absolutely no money to give you today, but I can offer you some excellent, priceless advice." Nasruddin looked at the man's old shoes, turned up his nose in a deeply disgusted tone, and said, "No thanks, sir. If you ain't got no money, I don't guess your advice is worth anything at all." This is the precise philosophy of your modern consumerist society. You judge the depth of a master's realization by the size of his organization, the luxury of his vehicles, or the price of his seminars. If a man is materially poor, the intellect immediately assumes his insights are worthless. But look at the history of human consciousness. The greatest revolutionaries of the soul, Socrates, Diogenes, Lao Tzu, Kabir, possessed no properties, carried no bank accounts, and lived in absolute simplicity. The intellect cannot separate eternal truth from worldly gold. It cannot separate consciousness from cash. It believes that success in the material world is the only valid proof of intelligence. But often, to become immensely successful in this corrupt, violent, and greedy social structure, you have to completely sacrifice your intelligence. You have to become ruthless, mechanical, and insensitive. True wisdom belongs to a completely different currency. It belongs to the inner kingdom of silent witnessing. It cannot be measured in coins, and the intellectual beggar will always miss it because his hands are only open for material tokens that perish in a moment. And because the intellect is constantly seeking validation, it loves to brag about its authority, even when that authority is restricted to the most helpless, insignificant dimensions of reality. It builds a majestic illusion of lordship to cover up its total domestic subjugation. A young man was chatting with his close friend Mullah Nasruddin over a warm pipe in the local village tavern and asked him pointedly, "Tell me the absolute truth, Nasruddin, who is really the boss in your house?" "Well," said Nasruddin, stroking his beard thoughtfully, "my wife assumes total, unconditional command of the children, the servants, the household budget, the dog, and the parakeet. But I must tell you, I say pretty much whatever I please to the goldfish. This goldfish tank is the exact perimeter of the human ego. You are dominated by your boss at work, crushed by your government, manipulated by your priests, and henpecked by your spouse. But you find a tiny, helpless creature, a goldfish, a submissive employee, a small child, and suddenly you become the supreme emperor. You shout at them, you impose your rules upon them. You display your absolute authority just to keep your fragile, bruised ego from collapsing into total despair. The intellect cannot exist in a state of pure equality. It doesn't understand the language of friendship and unconditional love. It must always create a hierarchy of master and slave. If it cannot rule the household, it will satisfy its thirst for power by dominating the fish. But a truly conscious human being has no desire to dominate anyone because his inner fulfillment is already complete. He doesn't need a victim to validate his strength. His strength is the silent presence of his own awakened being. The mind's vanity also shows itself in its love for showing off its accomplishments, its technical licenses, and its newly acquired skills, completely blind to the fact that its very first flight into pride might be its ultimate undoing. A wealthy, arrogant young man had just passed his intensive examination for his private pilot's license. Wanting to show off his supreme skill and make the entire village look at him with awe, he persuaded old Mullah Nasruddin to go up into the sky with him for an afternoon ride. The flight was an absolute nightmare. The young pilot looped the loop, dived recklessly towards the treetops, and shook the small plane with immense vanity. When they finally hit the runway and came to a stop, Nasruddin climbed out of the cockpit, fell to his knees, and kissed the solid earth. He turned to the pale young pilot and said, "Thank you so much for the 2 wonderful rides." The young man looked at him completely puzzled and asked, "What do you mean 2 rides, uncle?" You were up there in the sky with me for only one single ride." "Oh no," said Nasruddin, wiping the cold sweat from his eyes. "I had two, my very first and my absolute last. This is the sudden return of raw common sense over intellectual vanity. The young man has a piece of paper, a license, a mechanical toy, and he uses it to feed his pride, completely oblivious to the mortal danger of his arrogance. But the simple, direct experience of survival instantly awakens Nasruddin. He doesn't need a second lesson. His first experience is more than enough to shatter the illusion of technical glamour. The modern world is exactly like that reckless young pilot. Your scientists, your politicians, your technocrats have acquired a little bit of knowledge, a few intellectual formulas, and they are looping the loop with the entire biosphere. They are playing with nuclear weapons, destroying the equilibrium of the earth, diving towards global catastrophe, all to show off their intellectual mastery over nature. And the wise individual sits in the back seat, realizing that this intellectual field trip must be our first and our absolute last if we wish to preserve the flame of human life on this beautiful planet. The intellect is also completely helpless when its calculated structures crash into the unpredictable accidents of reality. It sits amidst the wreckage of its life, still trying to fill out its mental questionnaires and categories. Mullah Nasruddin was once lying completely still beside a horribly wrecked car in a deep ditch, his leg visibly broken, his body covered in bruises. A highway patrolman rushed down the embankment, pulled out his official notepad, and began his routine investigation. "Married?" asked the patrolman coldly, looking down at the bleeding man. "No," groaned Nasruddin, looking at his twisted automobile and his throbbing leg. "This is absolutely the worst mess I have ever been in." To Nasruddin's simple mind, being married and being in a horrible car wreck are placed in the exact same category of ultimate human disaster. The patrolman is asking for a legal status, a social label to fill his bureaucratic form, while Nasruddin is responding from the raw, unadulterated reality of his current pain. The intellect is always like that patrolman, bureaucratic, analytical, and completely detached from the living reality of suffering. When your life crashes, when your heart breaks, when your illusions shatter, your mind steps in with its notepad and asks, "What is your status? What is your philosophy? What is your explanation?" It wants to categorize the disaster instead of feeling it. It wants to give it a name so it can avoid the raw vulnerability of the moment. But names cannot heal a broken leg, and philosophies cannot heal a broken heart. You have to drop the notepad, look at the wreckage directly, and have the courage to experience your pain without trying to force it into a social register. And notice how the intellect relies on the dead past to justify its present survival. It cannot stand on its own 2 feet in the immediate present. It always needs a recommendation, a certificate from a ghost to validate its existence. A kind housewife gave Mullah Nasruddin a large, freshly made sandwich at her back door, but looking at his able body, she couldn't help but ask, "Haven't you been able to find any proper work in this town?" "Yes, lady, there is plenty of work available everywhere," said the mullah, chewing his bread, "but absolutely everybody wants a formal reference from my very last employer." "Well, can't you simply get one?" she asked. "No," said Nasruddin. "He has been dead for 20 years. This is the hilarious tragedy of human education and societal tradition. You are living in the year 26, but your mind is continuously looking for references from employers, priests, and philosophers who have been dead for 20 centuries. You cannot live your own life spontaneously. You must check if your actions align with Jesus, with Buddha, with Krishna, or with your dead grandfathers. You need a dead reference to validate your living presence. Your universities give you degrees based on dead books. Your churches give you morals based on dead scriptures. And your intellect feels perfectly secure because it is backed by a graveyard. But a reference from a ghost cannot nourish your living soul. It only turns you into a puppet of the past. To drop your stupidity means to have the courage to stand without any references, to face life naked, fresh, and immediate, relying entirely on your own inner light rather than the dusty certificates of the deceased. The intellect also possesses a very sophisticated form of cowardice that it frequently disguises as intellectual wisdom and strategic prudence. It avoids the challenges of life, and then it congratulates itself on being unharmed. What in the world happened at the village picnic yesterday? A fellow asked Mullah Nasruddin in the tavern. They are saying around here that you acted like an absolute coward when the challenge arose. Well, I am certainly no fool, the mullah said calmly. Some of the young girls found a massive hornet's nest in the top of a tall tree and dared me to climb up and bring it down. And I simply didn't do it. That's all. Whether you were smart or not, said the friend, that sort of behavior makes you completely unhonored and unsung around this village. That's absolutely right, said Nasruddin with a beautiful smile. But I am also entirely unharmed and unstung. Look at this logic. He trades honor for safety, glory for comfort, The intellect is always a calculator of risks. It tells you, don't love, because love carries the sting of rejection. Don't meditate, because meditation destroys your egoistic identity. Don't explore the unknown, because it is full of dangerous hornets. So, you remain unhonored and unsung by the divine forces of existence, but your intellect is perfectly satisfied because you are unharmed and unstung in your small, cozy prison of safety. You live a lukewarm life, never climbing the tree, never tasting the wild danger of the peak, because your mind prefers the security of the ground. But a life without risk is not a life at all. It is just a slow, safe passage to the grave. To find true wisdom, you must be willing to be stung by reality. You must have the courage to climb the tree of life, to face the hornets of insecurity, because it is only in that intense encounter that your true soul is forged. The intellect is also an absolute master of deception when it comes to covering up its own insatiable greed. It will perform a selfish act and claim it is doing it entirely for the benefit of another person. Mullah Nasruddin's wife looked at him with utter embarrassment at a lavish buffet supper. She leaned in and whispered, "Nasruddin, that is literally the 5th time you have gone back to the counter for more fried chicken. Doesn't it embarrass you in front of all these respectable guests?" "Not at all, my dear," he said smoothly. "I keep telling the chef that I am getting it entirely for you. This is the mechanics of human charity, human altruism, and social service. You go out into the world, accumulating power, accumulating prestige, accumulating wealth, and your intellect continuously tells the public, I am doing this entirely for my family, entirely for my nation, entirely for the poor. You use the other person as a shield to hide your own endless consumption. Your politicians claim they are sacrificing their lives for the country. Your priests claim they are suffering for the flock. And Nasruddin claims he is eating the 5th plate of chicken for his wife. It is all a transparent lie, fabricated by the head to prevent the ego from feeling the shame of its own naked greed. To step out of this stupidity, you must drop these hypocritical justifications. If you are greedy, own it. If you want power, admit it. Stop using your wives, your children, or humanity as an excuse for your personal ambitions. In that raw honesty, your greed will begin to lose its grip over you. The mind will continuously create these elaborate, sophisticated strategies of projection, avoidance, and calculation to keep you securely asleep in your comfortable, rigid patterns. To break free from this deep-seated mechanical stupidity, you do not need more information, more logic, or more degrees from your prestigious universities. You simply need the ultimate courage to open your eyes. Stand completely naked before the cosmic mirror of reality and laugh out loud at the brilliant, ridiculous comedies of your own egoistic intellect. Only through this total, unconditional inner honesty can you easily drop the heavy armor of your clever thoughts. Enter the silent valley of the human heart right now and finally awaken to the pristine, overflowing wisdom of your own true immortal soul. This immortal essence can never be realized as long as you are trapped in the social formatting of your expectations, especially the institution of marriage, which the intellect treats as a monumental achievement of security and happiness. The head is always anticipating the future, calculating its joy beforehand, completely unaware that the anticipation of a pleasure is often the only real pleasure you will ever experience. The moment the calculated event actually manifests, the reality of life turns out to be a heavy chain, a tedious repetition that completely suffocates your romantic illusions. Mullah Nasruddin beautifully exposed this psychological illusion when he walked up to a future bridegroom on the eve of his wedding. He shook his hand with great warmth, smiled deeply, and said, "Congratulations, my dear friend, on this extraordinary occasion, which is undoubtedly one of the absolute happiest days of your entire life." The young bridegroom looked at him with a slight frown of confusion and replied, "Thank you, Mullah, but I think you are a bit confused. I am not actually getting married until tomorrow morning." Nasruddin nodded sagely, patted him on the shoulder, and said, "I know that perfectly well, my boy. That is exactly what makes today one of the happiest days of your life. Look at the depth of this insight. The day before the wedding is beautiful because it is still full of dreams, full of projection, full of sweet anticipation. The cage door has not yet snapped shut. The bird is still free to imagine that the cage will be a golden palace of eternal bliss. The intellect lives entirely in the tomorrow, in the hope of what is to come, and it derives its current happiness from that fictitious future. But the moment tomorrow becomes today, the illusion evaporates like morning dew. The real woman appears, the real man appears, and with them come all the complexities, the possessiveness, the conditioning, and the friction of two egos trying to dominate each other. Nasruddin is reminding the young man that his happiness is based entirely on the absence of the reality he is pursuing. This is the ultimate stupidity of human desire. You are happy only as long as you don't possess the object of your craving. The moment you achieve it, the joy disappears, and you are left with a heavy, dead burden, wondering where the magic went. And because the intellect is trained by society to see safety as strength and escape as weakness. It completely misunderstands the true moments of human intelligence and awakening. It calls cowardice what is actually a sudden flash of clear common sense. Mullah Nasruddin and his wife were sitting by the window, comfortably gossiping about a scandalous wedding that had shocked the entire village that morning. "Just think about it," said the wife with deep disapproval. It was just as the beautiful bride was walking elegantly down the sacred aisle that the groom suddenly turned around, ran out of the church doors like a madman, and completely skipped town. I guess the poor fellow completely lost his nerve at the last second. Nasruddin looked up from his tea, smiled beautifully, and said, "Oh, I don't think so at all, my dear. I figure he finally found it. He didn't lose his nerve. He found his awareness." In that single, split second, as the bride was walking towards him, his entire life must have flashed before his eyes like a terrifying premonition. He saw the legal contracts, the endless arguments, the domestic trap, the slow strangulation of his free spirit, and in that moment of absolute clarity, his intelligence woke up. He ran away not out of fear, but out of a sudden, radical commitment to his own survival. But the societal intellect, represented by Nasruddin's wife, calls this a loss of nerve. Society wants you to be a predictable, well-behaved martyr. It wants you to walk into the slaughterhouse with a smile on your face, wearing a beautiful suit, accompanied by romantic music. If you run away, if you rebel, if you choose your own freedom over their conventional expectations, they will label you a coward, a lunatic, an irresponsible fool. But I tell you, that groom was the only intelligent man in the entire congregation. He chose the open sky over a respectable cage. To be intelligent means to be capable of such sudden, radical updates of your reality, even if it shatters the expectations of the crowd. The mind also develops a strange, detached, almost mechanical insensitivity when it is continuously subjected to the daily, repetitive dramas of family life. It becomes a passive observer of disasters, treating the most shocking events as mere passing objects in its field of vision. Mullah Nasruddin was once sitting quietly in his study, reading an ancient book of philosophy, when his little daughter came running into the room, screaming in absolute terror, crying her eyes out. "Daddy, Daddy," she wailed. "Mummy has just lost her footing and fallen completely off the high roof of the house." Nasruddin didn't jump up. He didn't drop his book. He didn't change his expression. He simply looked at the little girl and said calmly, "I know that perfectly well, my dear. I just saw her pass by the window." He saw her pass the window as if she were a falling leaf, a passing cloud, a random bird flying across the sky. This is the mechanical deadness that results from long years of domestic conditioning. The intellect prides itself on its equanimity, its calmness under pressure, its philosophical detachment, but this detachment is not the sublime silence of meditation, it is the cold, unfeeling paralysis of an exhausted soul. You live with someone for decades, and instead of your love growing deeper, your sensitivity becomes completely blunt. You become like two rocks rubbing against each other until you are both worn down into smooth, lifeless dust. Nasruddin's response is a terrifyingly accurate caricature of the modern intellectual husband. He is aware of the facts. He saw her pass the window, but he is completely disconnected from the existential meaning of the event. He doesn't see a human being in mortal danger. He sees a chronological sequence of visual data. This is what your logic does to you. It turns you into a digital camera that records everything but experiences absolutely nothing. This same ridiculous logic and complete lack of self-awareness dominate the dirty arena of politics, where the intellect reaches its absolute peak of corrupt sophistication. The politician can look at a completely crooked situation and complain about the corruption of others, using a logic that exposes his own crimes without him even realizing it. The local village election was being fiercely challenged by the defeated candidate Mullah Nasruddin, who was demanding a full investigation into the results. I know for an absolute fact that this entire election was utterly crooked and manipulated, Nasruddin shouted before the town council. The magistrate looked at him and asked, "Do you have any concrete proof of fraud, Mullah?" "Yes, I certainly do," said Nasruddin. "A very loyal friend of mine personally voted for me 15 separate times in the 3rd precinct alone, and yet I didn't receive but 4 votes total in that entire district. Look at this magnificent logic. He is exposing his own illegal manipulation, his own systematic fraud, in order to prove that the election was crooked because his illegal votes were not counted accurately by the other side. This is the exact state of your political mind. Every politician cries foul, every leader accuses the opposition of corruption, completely blind to the fact that their own entire existence is based on deceit, manipulation, and exploitation. The intellect can never see its own crookedness. It can only see the failure of its own crooked strategies. If Nasruddin had won through those 15 fraudulent votes, he would have declared the election a magnificent victory for democracy, an authentic expression of the people's will. But because the other side was even more corrupt, even more clever at cheating, his own fraud failed, and his intellect immediately became a passionate defender of justice and transparency. Your moral outrages are rarely about truth. They are almost always about the frustration of your egoistic designs. You don't hate the corruption, you just hate the fact that you lost the game of corruption to a bigger player. And watch how this political intellect behaves when it is forced to present its rivals to the public. It constructs a linguistic framework that looks immensely respectful and patriotic on the surface, but underneath it is an act of pure, cold-blooded malice. The two rival political candidates in the province were scheduled to speak at the county fair on the very same evening program, and Mullah Nasruddin was chosen as the neutral moderator to introduce them. He arose before the massive crowd, adjusted his robes, and spoke with thunderous eloquence. "My fellow citizens, I want to present to you a man who, above anyone else in this world, has the welfare of each and every one of you deeply at heart. More than anyone I have ever known, he is totally devoted to our great, glorious, and sacred nation." Then he stopped, leaned back, turned his face toward the two candidates sitting behind him, and asked in a quiet voice, "Which of you fellows wants to talk first?" He uses the exact same generic template of high praise for both of them, because to his sharp, cynical mind, all politicians are completely interchangeable. They all wear the same masks of patriotism. They all mouth the same empty promises of public welfare, and they are all driven by the exact same thirst for power and self-glorification. Nasruddin's introduction is a masterstroke of political satire. He shows that the words of praise mean absolutely nothing. They are just empty coins used to buy the votes of the sleeping masses. The intellect loves these grand abstract labels: the nation, the public good, the sacred heritage, because they serve as a beautiful camouflage for the raw, ugly reality of personal ambition. By refusing to specify which candidate he was talking about, Nasruddin exposed the taboo truth that behind the different party names and different colorful flags, the psychological structure of every politician is exactly the same: a mechanical, power-hungry machine that feeds on the compliance of the crowd. The intellect is also an absolute master of creating absurd, logical excuses to maintain its own comfortable dependency, preferring a slow, painful delay over a direct, conscious effort to change its situation. It will complain endlessly about its suffering, but when offered a simple solution, it will find an excuse to remain exactly where it is. Mullah Nasruddin was riding on a notoriously slow, ancient country bus, and for 3 hours he had been leaning forward, constantly complaining to the driver about the terrible speed, the roaring engine, and the inefficiency of the transportation system. After he couldn't stand the non-stop complaining for a single second longer, the exhausted driver slammed on the brakes, looked back at Nasruddin with a furious face, and yelled, "If you don't like the speed of this bus, why on earth don't you just get out of here and walk?" Nasruddin looked out the door, shook his head, and said, "I would love to do that, driver, but my wife is going to meet me at the station, and she doesn't expect me to arrive until this bus actually gets there. He wants the bus to arrive faster, but he refuses to walk because his wife's expectation is synchronized with the slowness of the vehicle." This is the absolute peak of intellectual stagnation. Your mind complains about your job, complains about your relationship, complains about your psychological misery. But the moment existence says, "Get out and walk, take your life into your own hands, become independent," your intellect immediately invents a brilliant excuse. It says, "I would change, but my family expects me to be this way, or my financial situation requires me to remain here, or the society is not ready for my transformation." You synchronize your misery with the expectations of the crowd. You prefer the comfort of a slow, predictable suffering over the vibrant, unpredictable effort of immediate freedom. Your complaints are nothing but a psychological exhaust valve. They allow you to look like a victim who desires change, while your actions prove that you are deeply in love with your own chains. You don't want to arrive faster. You just want to pass the time by screaming at the driver. And let us look at how the mind perceives the rare arrival of honesty in this world of calculation. Because it is so deeply accustomed to corruption, cheating, and competition, it views a simple man who wants to live truthfully, not as a saint, but as a direct threat to the market, or as a fool who has walked into a place where he cannot survive. A bright-eyed, idealistic new man had just moved into the village, and meeting Mullah Nasruddin in the town square, he announced with great pride and determination, "I have come out here to make an honest living." Nasruddin looked at him with an expression of deep compassion, smiled slightly and said, "Well, my young friend, you have certainly chosen the perfect place. There is absolutely no competition around here. There is no competition because honesty has completely gone out of business. In a world where everyone is a liar, a smooth talker, a politician, an honest man finds himself in a complete vacuum. The intellect thrives on competition, on beating the other person through cleverness, through strategy, through deceit. It has created a society where everyone is constantly guarding their pockets, constantly drafting legal contracts, constantly preparing for a betrayal. When someone arrives with simple, naked honesty, the intellect cannot comprehend it. It thinks either this man is an incredibly sophisticated trickster who is using honesty as a new strategy to deceive us, or he is a complete idiot who will starve to death within a week. Nasruddin's response is a devastating commentary on the total absence of true human values in our civilized societies. We have built our entire economy, our entire legal system, our entire structure of respectability on the foundation of mutual mistrust. Honesty is no longer a natural state of being. It has become a rare, exotic commodity, an eccentric hobby practiced only by those who are completely out of touch with the competitive market of survival. The intellect also reveals its utter absurdity when it tries to navigate its personal habits and domestic relationships. Through a rigid, fragmented system of rules, trying to control its impulses through a mechanical sequence that makes it look completely ridiculous to any detached observer. Mullah Nasruddin once rushed into the village bar, out of breath, panting heavily, and said breathlessly to the bartender, "Give me the usual, please, and hurry up. I got to catch my train in 5 minutes." The bartender immediately set up 5 strong martinis in a neat row on the counter. Nasruddin stepped forward, grabbed the second glass and gulped it down, then grabbed the third and fourth and drank them rapidly, leaving the first and the very last drinks completely untouched on the bar. Then he turned around and rushed out the door as rapidly as he had entered. A bewildered bystander walked up to the counter and asked the bartender why on earth that customer had left 2 perfectly good drinks behind. "Oh, he does that all the time," the bartender sighed. "He says, the first one always tastes terrible and the last one gets him in trouble at home. Look at this brilliant system. Because the first drink tastes bad, he simply skips the first position in the row, completely blind to the fact that whatever drink he tastes first becomes his first drink. And because the last drink causes trouble with his wife, he leaves the last glass on the table, totally unaware that the final drink he actually swallows is the one that intoxicates his system and smells on his breath when he walks through his front door. This is exactly how your moral and religious minds operate. You create an elaborate, mechanical system of rules to avoid consequences. You think that by altering the sequence of your actions, by changing the external labels, or by omitting certain formal steps, you can fool reality, fool your conscience, or fool your spouse. You commit a sin, and then you offer a specific prayer, thinking you have left the bad drink on the counter. You engage in greed, and then you give a tiny fraction to charity, believing you have skipped the first position. But existence cannot be deceived by your arithmetic tricks. The internal effect of your actions depends entirely on your consciousness, not on your mechanical formulas. You remain just as drunk, just as corrupt, and just as trapped, while your intellect congratulates itself on its brilliant, structural evasion. This arithmetic delusion is the tragic hallmark of a life lived entirely through the head, rather than through the direct innocence of the soul. You continuously try to rearrange the outer sequential patterns of your mechanical actions, believing that your mental calculations can somehow outsmart the absolute laws of universal consequence. But existence does not read your complex rules. It does not honor your hypocritical compromises, and it is entirely unmoved by your clever psychological omissions. True transformation requires you to drop these ridiculous arithmetic equations completely. Step away from the rows of your habituated illusions and awaken directly to the raw, unconditioned truth of your present reality. Only by terminating this endless, stupid intellectual evasion can you truly live your life with total inner integrity, alignment, and pure existential freedom. This dependency on dead labels and external standards completely blinds you to the existential value of your own breathing reality. The intellect is always terrified of the uncalculated, the unknown, and the spontaneous, which is why it surrounds itself with thick walls of social insurance, psychological defenses, and institutional security. It spends its entire life buying protection against potential catastrophes, preparing for a tomorrow that never comes, entirely oblivious to the fact that this obsessive protection is exactly what prevents it from truly living today. An exceptionally eager, smooth-talking insurance salesman once caught Mullah Nasruddin relaxing on his front porch. The salesman leaned forward, opened his leather portfolio with immense dramatic flair, and began his pitch. "Mullah, I am telling you that insurance is undoubtedly the absolute greatest, most magnificent thing ever invented in the modern world. Why, just to show you my personal commitment, I currently carry a massive 75,000 rupee policy on my own life, which is fully payable directly to my beautiful wife the moment I pass away." Nasruddin looked at the salesman's exhausted face, puffed eyes, and nervous sweat, smiled sweetly, and said, "In that case, my dear friend, what valid excuse do you possibly have for continuing to live?" To the purely commercial mind of the salesman, his value as a corpse is far greater than his value as a living human being. This is the ultimate destination of the intellectual ego. It reduces everything, including the sacred miracle of human life, to a cold financial balance sheet. The intellect asks, What am I worth? And it calculates that worth based on assets, bank accounts, and insurance policies. It creates a ridiculous situation where your death becomes a lucrative financial event for your family, while your life remains an absolute misery of non-stop work, anxiety, and accumulation. You are carrying a heavy policy to protect your loved ones after you die, but you are completely unable to give them your real presence, your joy, and your consciousness while you are still alive. You are an asset only in the graveyard. This is the supreme stupidity of the modern economic mind. It sacrifices the living presence for a dead security, turning the human being into a walking commercial product whose only true value is realized when it stops breathing. And because the intellect lives entirely in these abstract projections, its desires are always grand, massive, and structural, but its capacity to experience reality remains completely nullified. It plans a magnificent feast in the future, but it always wakes up before it can taste a single crumb. Mullah Nasruddin was once telling his wife about an extraordinary, vivid dream he had experienced the previous night. "Oh, it was absolutely terrible," he moaned, shaking his head in deep sorrow. "I dreamed that I was at a grand birthday celebration at Joe's house. His mother had baked a magnificent chocolate cake that was at least 3 feet high, and when she cut it open, everybody was given a massive piece that hung over the edges of the plate. Then she dipped up some delicious, rich, homemade ice cream, and she had so much of it that she had to give each one of us our share in a massive soup bowl." The wife looked at him with an expression of deep bewilderment and asked, "What on earth was so terrible about a beautiful dream like that?" Nasruddin sighed deeply and said, "Oh, the tragedy is that I woke up right before I could get my very first taste. This is the precise structure of all your human ambitions, your goals, and your psychological pursuits. Your mind is an absolute master at building a 3-foot-high chocolate cake of hope in the future. It promises you that when you achieve that specific degree, when you marry that beautiful person, when you acquire that luxury mansion, or when you attain that high corporate status, you will experience an overflowing soup bowl of happiness. You spend years running toward that projection, sweating, competing, and destroying your peace of mind. But the moment you are about to touch it, reality breaks the spell. You wake up. You wake up to the fact that the projection was empty, that the anticipation was the only substance it ever had, and that you are still the same empty, unfulfilled person sitting on an old mattress. The intellect is an expert at postponing the taste of life to an elusive tomorrow. It keeps you perpetually dreaming, and the real tragedy of your life is not that your dreams don't come true, but that they vanish the moment you wake up to the immediate reality of the present moment. The intellect also experiences a profound, terrifying shock when its inner unconscious madness, fueled by its heavy toxic habits and escapes, suddenly takes a physical form and stares it directly in the face. It finds itself trapped in a bizarre reality where it cannot tell if the madness belongs to the outside world or to its own psychology. It had been an exceptionally big, wild night at the village tavern, and Mullah Nasruddin had to be completely carried back to his small shack by his exhausted friends. When he finally woke up the next afternoon, his head throbbing with a massive hangover, he opened his eyes and was absolutely startled to see a huge, terrifying ape sitting quietly on the foot of his bunk bed, staring intently into his face. Nasruddin didn't scream. He didn't run. Instead, he carefully, slowly reached under his pillow for his loaded revolver. He took careful aim directly between the ape's eyes and said with a trembling voice, "Look here, if you are a real monkey, you are undoubtedly in a very bad fix. But if you are not a real monkey, then I am. Look at this naked clarity. If the ape is a real biological entity, then it is in a bad fix because it is staring at a loaded gun held by a drunkard. But if the ape is a hallucination, a projection of Nasruddin's own intoxicated, suffering mind, then Nasruddin is the one who is in an absolute, total, mad fix. This is the exact condition of the human ego. You look at your anxieties, your enemies, your fears, and your projections in the outside world, and you treat them as real threats. You take aim at them with your logic, your weapons, and your strategies. But a conscious man looks at you and laughs, because he knows that the monsters you are fighting are entirely the creations of your own unmeditated unconscious mind. Your enemies are your own projected anger. Your anxieties are your own projected insecurity. The world you see outside is nothing but a cosmic mirror reflecting the chaotic state of your inner being. If you don't clean your consciousness, if you don't drop the intoxication of your thoughts, you will spend your entire life pointing a gun at a ghost, completely unaware that the real madness is sitting inside the cockpit of your own head. The intellect also loves to use scientific data, psychological articles, and modern research to manipulate its domestic environment, trying to bend the rules of relationship to serve its own physical comfort and lazy patterns. Mullah Nasruddin once walked into the kitchen, holding a morning newspaper with an air of great intellectual superiority. He looked at his busy wife and said, "My dear, listen to this scientific discovery. This prominent article clearly states that women naturally require significantly more sleep every single day than men do." The wife stopped cleaning, looked at him with an absolute look of total clarity, and said, "Is that really right?" "Yes, dear," said the mullah smoothly, packing his pipe. "So, based on this scientific truth, maybe you'd better not wait up for me at all tonight." He uses an objective scientific fact regarding her biology just to justify his own late-night drinking habits at the tavern. This is the exact strategy of your rational mind. It utilizes the language of truth, the language of research, the language of scripture to validate its own egoistic desires. The intellect is never interested in truth for its own sake. It is interested in truth only as an instrument of manipulation. You read a spiritual book not to dissolve your ego, but to learn new terminology so you can dominate your friends in an intellectual discussion. You study psychology not to understand your own neurosis, but to acquire diagnostic labels so you can conveniently pathologize your partner during an argument. The head is a corrupted lawyer that can take the most sacred truth and turn it into a tool for domestic evasion. It pretends to be concerned about the other person's sleep, while it is entirely focused on ensuring its own unmonitored freedom to indulge in unconscious patterns. And watch what happens when the intellect finally realizes that its inner misery is caused by its own moral programming. It doesn't look for a spiritual liberation. It goes to a professional specialist, a psychiatrist, asking for a technical trick to weaken its awareness so it can commit its sins without feeling any discomfort. Mullah Nasruddin once called on a prominent city psychiatrist, sat down on the leather couch, and announced that he had deep psychological problems and needed immediate expert help. "I want to talk to you very frankly, doctor," said the mullah, "because my ethics have not been what they should be lately, and my internal conscience is bothering me to death." The psychiatrist nodded understandingly, leaned forward, and said, "I completely understand your situation, my friend. You want me to help you build up a stronger willpower, to fortify your moral defenses against temptation. Is that it?" "No," shouted Nasruddin with deep irritation. "That's not it at all. I want you to try to weaken my conscience so I can enjoy my life without this constant inner nagging. This is the taboo truth about your so-called therapy, your modern counseling, and your self-help systems. You don't want to drop your greed. You don't want to drop your violence. You don't want to drop your deceptions. You simply want to drop the guilt that follows them. You want a psychological technique that allows you to remain a corrupt, greedy egoist while sleeping peacefully like an innocent baby at night. The intellect views the conscience as a biological malfunction, a design flaw in the human machine that creates unnecessary friction. It doesn't look for consciousness, which is the ultimate transcendence of both good and bad. It looks for an absolute anesthesia. It wants to behave like a beast, but feel like a saint. This is the supreme hypocrisy of the modern mind. It goes to therapists not to be awakened, but to be more comfortably hypnotized, to have its inner alarms turned off so it can continue to walk blindly toward its own destruction without being disturbed by the screaming voice of its inner truth. This complete refusal to face the naked reality of facts is why the intellect is always a terrible loser in the political game, turning its objective failures into a tragic story of victimhood, pretending that it was defeated not by its own lack of capability, but by an external conspiracy of precision. Mullah Nasruddin had recently lost out completely in the local village election, receiving a humiliatingly small number of votes, and he was sitting in the tea house, feeling immensely sorry for himself. "I was a victim," he moaned to his companions, pounding his fist on the table. "Nothing but a helpless, pure victim." A friend looked at him and asked, "A victim? A victim of what exactly, Mullah? Did the opposition buy the votes? Did they burn the ballots?" "No," shouted Nasruddin with deep indignation. "I was a victim of accurate counting. If the counting had been corrupt, if the counting had been sloppy, he might have had a chance to sneak into power through his own clever manipulations. But the absolute accuracy of the arithmetic system left no room for his illusions, and his intellect immediately interpreted this precision as a personal assault, an act of persecution. This is how the mind reacts to the ultimate laws of existence. Existential laws are absolutely accurate, perfectly precise. If you live in anger, the result is an immediate hell within your heart. If you live in ego, the result is immediate isolation and misery. There is no error in the accounting of existence. It doesn't need a human judge or a cosmic ledger. The consequence is inherent in the action itself. But when your life becomes a total desert of misery, your intellect screams, "I am a victim of bad luck, a victim of a cruel destiny, a victim of an unjust world." You refuse to see that you are simply a victim of accurate existential counting. Existence is simply mirroring your own inputs. If you sow seeds of poison, you cannot harvest mangoes, and when the poison fruits appear, crying conspiracy is the ultimate form of intellectual stupidity. The intellect also assumes an air of supreme critical authority when faced with the creative expressions of others, using its own mechanical state of sleep as if it were a valid, highly sophisticated philosophical opinion on the quality of their work. A young, passionate village playwright once gave a special, personal invitation to Mullah Nasruddin to watch the grand premiere of his brand new tragedy. The mullah came to the theater, sat in the front row, but the moment the curtains opened, he closed his eyes and slept soundly through the entire magnificent performance, snoring loudly during the most dramatic scenes. The young playwright was deeply insulted, indignant, and approached him after the show with a furious face. "How could you possibly sleep like a pig through my entire play, Nasruddin, when you knew perfectly well how much I desperately valued your expert opinion?" Nasruddin opened his eyes slowly, looked at the furious writer, and said, "Young man, you don't understand the nature of criticism at all. Sleep is an opinion. This is a professional, multi-layered truth. On one hand, his sleep is indeed a devastatingly accurate review of the play. It means the play was so boring, so artificial, so dead that it acted as a perfect, non-chemical sleeping pill for his consciousness. It didn't have the fire of life required to keep a man awake. But on a deeper level, this is the exact condition of the collective human mind when faced with the grand play of existence. The universe is putting on a magnificent, ecstatic show every single second. The sun rises in absolute gold. The stars whisper eternal secrets. The rivers dance towards the ocean, and you are sleeping through it all. You are walking down the street, completely wrapped up in your internal monologues, your financial worries, your small intellectual arguments, totally oblivious to the cosmic symphony playing around you. And if someone asks you why you are so disconnected, your intellect steps forward with its grand philosophical theories, its political ideologies, its scientific dogmas, and says, "My sleep is an opinion. My apathy is a sophisticated outlook on life." Your entire intellectual philosophy is nothing but a grand justification for your deep spiritual slumber. And because the intellect lives entirely in its preconditioned categories, its definitions, and its dictionary words, it is completely unable to recognize an organic reality when that reality deviates even slightly from its textbook descriptions. It prefers a structural explanation over a direct, naked sight. A very young, highly educated city girl was visiting the countryside for the first time in her life, and she was walking through the meadows with Mullah Nasruddin. Suddenly, she spotted a creature grazing quietly by the fence, stopped in her tracks, and cried out in deep bewilderment, "Oh Mullah, look at that incredibly strange, funny looking cow over there. Why on earth doesn't it have any horns on its head?" Nasruddin looked at the animal, adjusted his turban, and said with an air of immense academic authority, "Well, my dear girl, there are many complex biological reasons why a cow does not grow horns. Some breeds do not develop them until very late in life. Others are systematically dehorned by the farmers for safety. Some specific genetic lines are completely polled and are never supposed to have horns at all. But I must tell you, this particular cow does not have any horns primarily because it is a horse. Look at this magnificent lecture. He brings out all the zoological theories, all the agricultural methodologies, all the genetic classifications to explain a phenomenon that requires nothing but a single second of clear, unclouded sight. The animal doesn't have horns because it belongs to an entirely different species. But the intellectual mind is so loaded with information, so bursting with explanations, that it completely misses the obvious truth staring it in the face. This is what your universities have done to you. They have filled your heads with thousands of elaborate theories about God, about love, about life, about meditation, and when you look at reality, you try to fit it into those footnotes. You see a human being, and instead of relating to their living presence, you analyze them through the lens of psychology, sociology, or racial categorization. You look at your own heart, and instead of feeling its native joy, you check if your symptoms align with a medical textbook. You are looking at a horse and giving a brilliant dissertation on why it is a funny-looking cow. This is the absolute peak of educated stupidity. You have so much knowledge about things that you have completely lost the simple capacity to see things as they are. This intellectual layer of heavy conditioning acts as a structural screen, permanently separating your empty head from the clear, luminous reality of existence, turning your entire biological presence into a ridiculous, blind puppet show managed by borrowed textbook concepts. This screen of words and definitions is what prevents you from understanding the simplest movements of everyday human interaction. The intellect is always preoccupied with its own self-image, its own concepts of politeness, or its own structural anxieties, completely missing the practical reality of the present situation. It overanalyzes the behavior of others, assigning deep motivations or polite gestures to things that are born out of pure, basic necessity, transforming a simple, straightforward circumstance into a ridiculous comedy of errors. Mullah Nasruddin beautifully illustrated this common mental distortion on a crowded village bus. The bus was absolutely packed with people, and when a little old lady climbed aboard, Struggling to find her balance, Nasruddin immediately stood up from his seat to offer it to her. However, the old lady misunderstood his movement. She pushed the mullah back down gently by his shoulders and said, "No, thank you, young man. Please stay seated." Nasruddin tried to rise a second time, but she immediately pushed him back into the seat a second time, insistently smiling at him. Finally, out of breath and desperate, Nasruddin shouted to her, "Please let me get up, lady. I am already 2 blocks past my stop now. Look at this ridiculous polite misunderstanding." The old lady's intellect was so full of its own ideas about manners and etiquette that she assumed Nasruddin was performing a continuous act of noble chivalry, completely blind to the fact that his actions were driven by a simple, practical necessity to leave the vehicle. This is exactly how your mind operates in relationships. Someone does something simple, spontaneous, or necessary, and your logical head immediately begins to build a grand psychological theory around it. You assign hidden motives, noble virtues, or secret malicious intentions to ordinary actions. And through this constant overinterpretation, you completely lose touch with the simple reality of the situation. You force the other person to remain in a position they are desperately trying to escape from, all because your rigid concepts of how things should look prevent you from seeing what is actually happening right before your eyes. The intellect also applies this mechanical, quantitative approach to the field of religion, viewing spirituality as a commercial enterprise that should yield clear, immediate, measurable results according to a timeline. An eager member of the local church finance committee once called on Mullah Nasruddin at his house. "I am calling to collect your yearly contribution to the grand fund for converting the heathen in the distant lands," the man said. "Last year you gave us 1 rupee for this cause." Nasruddin looked at him in total surprise, widened his eyes, and shouted, "What? Do you mean to tell me that you haven't converted them yet?" To his simple mind, an investment is made to achieve a specific result, and if the organization is efficient, the work should be completed within a reasonable time frame. He thinks that 1 rupee should have been enough to finish the business of conversion, exposing the absolute absurdity of turning spiritual orientation into a bureaucratic, financial campaign. Your organized religions are built entirely on this corporate mentality. They ask for donations. They build massive institutions, they count their members, and they treat the awakening of the human soul as if it were a manufacturing process. The intellect cannot understand that true religiousness is an uncalculating, overflowing state of consciousness. It is not a project to modify the beliefs of others through financial investments. By looking for results, by treating spirituality as a market, you turn the sacred search for truth into a dead institutional business, remaining completely empty inside while contributing to the expansion of external illusions. And look at how the mind behaves when it is trapped in chronic financial debt, completely detached from the moral anxiety that society tries to impose upon it. It treats its creditors with the exact same illusion of luxury, using unpaid goods to finance its current vanity. Mullah Nasruddin lived far beyond his financial means and was constantly being hounded day and night by his angry creditors. But he was so deeply accustomed to their presence that they caused him absolutely no distress or worry. In fact, he always treated them with the utmost elegant courtesy. Once, he went so far as to serve a prominent bill collector a glass of expensive, chilled champagne. The collector looked at the bubbling glass, grew furious, and demanded, "If you cannot afford to pay your honest debts, how on earth can you afford to serve luxury champagne?" Nasruddin smiled smoothly, patted his shoulder, and said, "Don't get sore, my friend. I assure you, this hasn't been paid for either, sir. He uses one unpaid debt to entertain another creditor, creating a beautiful, looping pyramid of pure illusion. This is the exact structure of your modern global economy and your personal psychological defenses. You borrow peace from tomorrow to cover up the anxiety of today. You use a new illusion to hide the bankruptcy of an old belief system. The intellect believes it is being incredibly clever by playing these games of postponement, shifting its liabilities from one box to another, completely blind to the fact that the entire foundation is hollow. You are living a life financed by borrowed thoughts, borrowed virtues, and borrowed identities. And when reality demands an authentic payment, you simply bring out another bottle of unpaid champagne to distract the collector. You don't want to become honest. You just want to maintain the appearance of luxury while standing on the brink of absolute inner bankruptcy. The political intellect also shows its total division when faced with the anxiety of losing its status, revealing that its apparent concern for the public is nothing but a mask to cover its desperate need for personal occupation. Mullah Nasruddin had been working day and night throughout his entire district in a desperate life or death struggle for re-election to the town council. One evening, following a long, exhausting speech, he was relaxing in the living room of a close friend. His friend looked at his tired face and said, Nasruddin, I have heard all your speeches, but I think the real question we must face is what you will do if you are re-elected to this high office. Nasruddin shook his head, sighed deeply, and replied, No, my friend, you have it completely wrong. The real, terrifying question is, what on earth will I do if I am not? He has no vision for the town, no program for the public welfare. His only real anxiety is his own existential emptiness. If he loses his position of power, the intellect needs a political office, a corporate title, or a social role just to avoid facing its own inner void. Without the title, without the non-stop running of the election, Nasruddin is forced to look at himself, and that self-reflection is the most terrifying thing in the world for a conditioned mind. This is why your leaders never retire voluntarily. They keep clinging to power until their last breath. They are not serving you. They are desperately using you as an audience to validate their fictitious existence. The moment the office is taken away, their armor vanishes, leaving behind a hollow, useless ghost. This total dependency on external status to achieve an illusion of being is a primary characteristic of the mechanical mind. The mind also develops a strange, defensive humor to cope with its physical suffering, turning the most brutal bodily damage into a superficial joke just to keep its ego from admitting its total vulnerability before the forces of nature. A young, inexperienced village preacher was visiting the local hospital where Mullah Nasruddin was confined following a catastrophic automobile accident. The mullah had been seriously injured. He had a broken leg. Both arms were broken. His collarbone was shattered. Terrible cuts covered his face, and several ribs were fractured. He was so thoroughly bandaged, taped, strapped, and plastered from head to foot that only his 2 eyes and his mouth were visible through the white cotton. The young preacher was completely at a loss for words, but realizing he must say something spiritual, he leaned over and asked, "How do you feel today, brother? I suppose all of those broken bones caused an immense, unbearable amount of pain. Do you suffer very much?" Nasruddin looked through his bandages and whispered, "No, not much, sir. Only when I laugh." He only suffers when he laughs. But the joke is that his entire life has become an absurd comedy that forces him to laugh. The intellect tries to maintain its humorous, detached stance even when it is completely crushed by the physical reality of a broken body. This is what you call psychological stoicism. But it is nothing but a desperate defense mechanism to avoid experiencing the raw reality of pain. You refuse to cry, You refuse to scream. You refuse to allow yourself to feel the full depth of your vulnerability. You put on a brave face. You crack a joke, and you pretend that everything is under control, while inside you are bleeding to death. This resistance to pain is what converts simple physical suffering into a chronic, looping psychological misery. To transcend your stupidity, you must drop the bandages of your intellectual defenses and have the radical courage to feel your pain directly, without jokes, without rationalizations, and without masks. And watch how the intellect turns friendship into a mutual game of economic exploitation, deriving a sense of livelihood from a repetitive cycle of trading the exact same object back and forth, completely blind to the absolute pointlessness of the entire transaction. A clever village mechanic once fixed up an old, broken car and sold it to his close friend, Mullah Nasruddin. The next morning, the mechanic felt a deep surge of regret for letting it go, so he went back to see the mullah and said, "I want to buy the car back from you, and to be fair, I will give you a $50 profit." Nasruddin happily agreed and sold it back. The following day, the mullah felt sorry that he had lost the car, looked up the mechanic, and said, "I want it back, and I will give you a $75 profit." So he bought it back. The next morning, the mechanic was sorry again, came to Nasruddin, and bought it back for a $100 profit. This went on for days until the mullah came to buy it back again, only to find out that the mechanic had suddenly sold the car to a used car dealer from a distant town. Nasruddin became completely furious, stamped his feet, and shouted, "You absolute dope! Why on earth did you sell that car to a complete stranger, especially when both of us were making such a wonderful, beautiful living out of it?" They were generating thousands of dollars of fictitious profit by simply moving the exact same junk car back and forth between their driveways every single day. This is the absolute peak of economic calculation and intellectual stupidity. It is a perfect miniature model of your modern stock markets, your financial banking systems, and your real estate speculations. You move numbers on a screen. You trade the same assets back and forth, inflating their artificial value through pure greed, and your intellect congratulates itself on making a wonderful living out of absolute nothingness. You create a complex illusion of wealth, completely blind to the fact that no real value has been produced, no real food has been grown, and no real creativity has been expressed. The moment a stranger walks in and takes away the physical object, the entire psychological illusion collapses, leaving you exposed in your total structural emptiness, The mind loves these repetitive, circular games because they keep it busy and give it a false sense of prosperity, while completely distracting it from the real business of life, which is the inner realization of your true being. The intellect is also completely immune to moral intimidation, using its own domestic circumstances to domesticate the ultimate symbols of terror, turning the devil himself into a familiar family relative just to justify its ongoing habits. Mullah Nasruddin was drinking far too much liquor, and his behavior began to seriously worry his village friends. Finally, they figured out a clever plan to cure him of his addiction through shock therapy. One dark night, as Nasruddin was staggering home completely drunk through the cemetery, a friend jumped out from behind a massive tombstone, dressed up like the devil with long horns, a terrifying face, and a sharp pitchfork. The devil blocked his path and shouted with a thunderous voice, "You must stop drinking immediately, or I will drag your soul to hell." Nasruddin stopped, blinked his blurry eyes, looked at the monster from head to foot, held out his hand, and said with a warm smile, "Oh, so you are the devil. I am absolutely glad to meet you, sir. I am the guy who married your sister. If he has been living with the devil's sister for 15 years, the devil himself holds absolutely no terror for his mind. He treats the king of hell as a brother-in-law, completely neutralizing the moral shock that his friends had so carefully prepared. This is how the human mind domesticates its fears. You have built such a hellish domestic life, such a chaotic inner environment of anxiety, anger, and psychological conflict, that no external threat, no scriptural warning of damnation can shake you out of your slumber. You are already living in hell, so the arrival of the devil looks like a family reunion. The intellect rationalizes its toxic habits by comparing them to its everyday miseries, concluding that since life is already a disaster, there is no point in trying to become sober or aware. It accepts its degeneration with a cynical laugh, transforming the most serious alarms of consciousness into a cheap domestic joke. And see how the mind manages its moral values, separating actions into rigid compartments where a flagrant criminal act is celebrated as a mark of success, provided the individual maintains a superficial adherence to verbal honesty. Mullah Nasruddin was sitting under a tree, chatting with a neighbor, when his young son Abdul came walking up the country road, proudly carrying a fat chicken under his arm. "Where on earth did you get that beautiful chicken, my boy?" Nasruddin asked. "Stole it," said the boy. Nasruddin turned to his neighbor, his face beaming with immense parental pride, and said, "This is my boy. He may steal, but he won't lie. He is perfectly happy that his son is a thief, as long as the boy doesn't violate the verbal rule of telling the truth. This is the exact condition of your societal morality. You create a code of ethics that focuses entirely on superficial forms while ignoring the real substance of human character. Your politicians steal the wealth of the nation. Your corporations steal the fruits of human labor. Your priests steal your psychological freedom, but because they do it legally, or because they admit it with a smooth, transparent smile, your intellect praises their integrity. You value the verbal label over the existential action. Nasruddin's pride is a devastating caricature of your educational and religious training. You teach your children how to follow rules, how to speak correctly, how to maintain a respectable appearance, while completely ignoring the fact that their hearts are full of greed, violence, and theft. You prefer a polished, honest criminal over an unrefined, chaotic innocent, because the polished one knows how to play the language games of the intellect. The intellect also reveals its ultimate fragmentation when it compares abstract, astronomical wealth with a single physical coin, treating the massive numbers as a fictitious game, but instantly waking up to maximum calculation the moment a single real dollar enters its immediate field of vision. Mullah Nasruddin and one of his close friends were lying flat on the green grass beside a quiet country road. Above them was the warm sun, birds were singing beautifully in the trees, and it was a perfectly restful, peaceful scene. "Boy," said the mullah looking at the sky, "right now I would not change places with anybody in this world, not even for $1 million cash." His friend looked at him and asked, "How about $5 million, mullah?" "No, not even for 5 million, said the mullah. "Well," said the friend, "how about $1? Nasruddin instantly sat up straight. His eyes widened, and he shouted, "Well, that's different. Now you are talking real money." To drop your stupidity means to see this internal contradiction directly. To realize that your high intellectual declarations are nothing but a sophisticated cover for a very small, primitive, and highly defensive ego. The intellect can never give a simple, silent response to life. It must unpack its entire warehouse of old memories, parameters, and calculations the moment an opportunity arises, permanently separating you from the clear, unconditioned innocence of the present moment. This is the taboo truth about your entire life. Your head has become an absolute tyrant that isolates you from the simple harmony of existence, turning every single encounter into a cold clinical transaction. To step out of this profound, highly educated slumber right now. You must have the radical courage to stop this continuous mental tape recorder. Drop your brilliant logic completely and return completely to the pristine sweetness of your own hidden inner soul. Become a wise fool in the eyes of this mad world. Easily drop the head entirely and dissolve completely and comfortably into the silent, laughing valley of the beautiful human heart, where there are no profits to calculate, and where your true immortal being can finally breathe in perfect, absolute, unconditional, and eternal freedom.